The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the quiet village. It was the kind of night where even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was waiting for something to happen. And something was about to happen. A story so strange, so chilling, that it would be talked about for generations. But what happened on that fateful night begins with a woman, a coffin, and an unlikely companion, a wolf. In a small, remote village tucked deep in the forest, people knew everyone's business. Secrets didn't stay secrets for long. But some things were too mysterious even for the sharp tongues of the villagers. This is where our story begins, with a woman named Clara. Clara wasn't a typical villager. She was different. Some would say there was something wild in her, something untamed that made the townspeople uneasy. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but when Clara spoke, people listened. When she walked into a room, it was as if the air around her changed. But no one could have anticipated what would happen when Clara suddenly fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances. The whole village was shaken, but not as much as Clara's funeral would shake them. It wasn't the sorrow that lingered in the air as they gathered at her gravesite, nor the somber faces of family and friends. No, it was the wolf. The wolf that had been seen wandering around her home in the weeks leading up to her death, pacing back and forth in the woods. No one could explain why it had appeared. Some whispered that it was a sign of the supernatural, while others simply thought it was a wild animal in the area. But on the day of her funeral, when the villagers were standing around Clara's coffin, the wolf appeared. It wasn't just any wolf. It was large, with fur as dark as the night sky, and eyes that glowed with an unsettling intensity. The creature walked slowly, cautiously, as if it knew the importance of the moment. The villagers watched in stunned silence as it approached the coffin. Some tried to shoo it away, but the wolf refused to leave. It lay down next to Clara's coffin, its body forming a perfect circle around it. For hours, it did not move. It stayed there, guarding the woman who had once walked among them like a mystery they could never solve. But why? Why would this wolf refuse to leave? And what could it possibly have to do with Clara's death? As the villagers stood in stunned silence, there were no answers. Only more questions. Days passed, and the wolf was still there, never straying far from the coffin. The townspeople grew increasingly nervous. They whispered among themselves, exchanging stories and theories. Some believed the wolf was guarding Clara's spirit, while others thought it was a sign of something darker. As the mystery deepened, a local doctor, Dr. Henry Caldwell, who had been Clara's physician in her final days, decided to investigate. He had always been a man of logic and science, unwilling to buy into tales of curses and supernatural forces. But what he had learned about Clara's condition before her death had troubled him. She had been fine one day and gravely ill the next, with symptoms that made no sense to him. The doctor had seen a lot of strange things in his career, but nothing that could explain the wild behavior of the wolf. So, one night, driven by a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, he ventured out to the graveyard. He had to know what was going on. What was this connection between Clara and the wolf? And why had the creature stayed by her side for so long? As Dr. Caldwell approached the coffin, he noticed the wolf's eyes lock onto him. There was something unsettling about the way it watched him, as if it understood exactly who he was and what he was there to do. It was a strange feeling, one that made the doctor's heart race. But he didn't back down. He wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had spent his life trying to uncover the mysteries of the human body and mind. This would be no different. But as he drew closer to the coffin, he made a discovery that would change everything. Something that defied all logic, all reason. Something that would make him question everything he knew about Clara, and about life itself. What he found in that coffin shocked him to his core. The truth was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined, and it was only just beginning to unravel. The doctor's discovery would lead him down a path filled with more questions, more danger, and more secrets than he ever thought possible. But the question remained, why had the wolf stayed by Clara's coffin all this time? What was it protecting? And could the doctor uncover the truth before it was too late? Stay tuned, because the answer is even more shocking than you can imagine. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen for a moment, staring at the wolf and then back at Clara's coffin. The creature's glowing eyes seemed to pierce the night, unblinking and filled with an almost human awareness. He could feel the weight of its gaze, a pressure in the air that made his skin crawl. The soft rustle of leaves in the trees above was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The doctor's heart thudded in his chest, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. He had heard the whispers, of course. The villagers spoke of Clara like she was some kind of enigma, an outsider who had arrived in town years ago and never quite fit in. She'd been quiet, solitary, with no family to speak of, and a mysterious air about her that sparked endless speculation. Some said she had been a healer in another life, someone who knew the ways of herbs and potions. Others claimed she was a witch, her strange behaviors and unusual habits proof enough of her otherworldly connection. But Dr. Caldwell had always dismissed those rumors, chalking them up to the idle gossip of small-town life. Yet, he couldn't ignore what had happened in the days leading up to Clara's death. Her sudden and rapid decline had baffled him. One day she was healthy, and the next, she was bedridden, racked with fever and pain. Her body seemed to betray her at every turn, as though something within her was slowly shutting down. He had tried every treatment he knew, but nothing worked. Nothing made sense. The symptoms were vague, almost impossible to diagnose. He had seen cases of sudden illness before, but nothing as strange and unexplainable as Clara's. Now, here he was, standing at her graveside, with the wolf that had become a strange and constant presence. The creature had never left, not even for a moment. It had stayed by her side throughout the funeral, refusing to be driven away. In the days following, it continued to circle the graveyard at night, never straying far from the coffin. The villagers had started to avoid the area, afraid of what the wolf might signify. But Dr. Caldwell was determined to find out the truth. He crouched down, keeping his eyes locked on the wolf. His breath fogged in the cold night air, but his focus never wavered. He slowly reached for the coffin, a sense of foreboding settling in the pit of his stomach. The wolf watched him carefully but didn't move. With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden lid. The interior was just as it should be, empty of any signs of disturbance. Clara's body was not there. At least, not in the traditional sense. What he found instead sent a chill through his spine. Inside the coffin, hidden beneath the worn fabric of her burial shroud, was something he could not explain. A strange, dark shape, almost like a shadow, shifted ever so slightly. At first, he thought it was just the light playing tricks on him, but as he moved closer, he realized it wasn't a trick at all. The wolf growled softly behind him, its eyes never leaving his. Dr. Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that it was warning him, protecting something, or someone. He hesitated, his fingers trembling as they touched the edges of the shroud, pulling it back to reveal the truth. It wasn't just the wolf guarding Clara's final resting place. Something else had been hidden away, something that no one could have anticipated. Beneath the fabric, nestled against the cool earth of the grave, was a small, intricately carved box. The wood was worn, its edges smoothed by time, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It didn't belong to the time or place. It seemed older, ancient even. A sense of dread filled the air as Dr. Caldwell picked up the box, turning it over in his hands. He could feel a weight to it, not just physical, but something deeper, something that tugged at his instincts. The wolf's growl deepened, more insistent now. The doctor had no doubt the creature would attack if he didn't leave soon, but his curiosity was stronger than ever. He had to know what was inside. Slowly, carefully, he opened the box. Inside, nestled within a bed of dark velvet, was a small vial filled with a strange, glimmering liquid. It wasn't like any substance Dr. Caldwell had ever seen before. The liquid seemed to shift and shimmer, as if it contained a light of its own, something alive. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. He reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the vial, a sharp, almost electric shock jolted through his body. He pulled his hand back instinctively, feeling the lingering sensation of something unnatural. The wolf barked sharply, breaking the tension that had been building between man and creature. Dr. Caldwell snapped the box shut, and with shaking hands, he placed it back in the coffin. The wolf immediately calmed, its gaze softening slightly but never leaving the doctor. This was not just a wolf. This was a protector, a guardian of something far older and far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. And whatever was in that vial, whatever connection it had to Clara's sudden illness and death, was the key to this entire mystery. The doctor's mind spun with questions. How had Clara come to possess such a vial? What was in it? And why had the wolf remained with her even after death? He could feel the weight of the questions pressing on him, urging him to find answers. But the more he thought about it, the less certain he became. Every lead only seemed to open up more paths of uncertainty. He had to know more. He had to find the answers that lay hidden beneath the surface of Clara's death. And yet, a part of him, deep down, feared what he might uncover. Was there something more to Clara's illness than just a medical mystery? Was it possible that she had been involved in something that defied all logic, something that even science couldn't explain? But as he turned to leave the graveyard, the wolf's growl stopped him in his tracks. The creature stood, its body rigid, its eyes fixed on the horizon. There, just beyond the edge of the graveyard, something moved in the trees. Something or someone was watching him. The doctor's breath caught in his throat as he took a step backward. He wasn't alone. And whoever, or whatever, was out there, had just stepped into his life. The air in the graveyard grew heavier, the quiet only broken by the rustle of leaves as Dr. Caldwell slowly turned his head, trying to make out what had moved in the trees. The wolf, standing like a sentinel beside the grave, growled low, a warning that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just the usual warning of a wild animal defending its territory, this was different. The wolf's posture was rigid, its body tense, as if it recognized something, or someone, dangerous was near. The doctor's heart raced. He was no stranger to danger. He'd treated patients in war zones, dealt with emergencies, and even faced threats that seemed to come from the very edge of reason. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. His instincts told him to leave, to run, but curiosity held him in place. Something in the darkness beyond the trees beckoned him, a pull he couldn't explain. He took a cautious step forward, but his foot landed on a twig, snapping it with a loud crack. The sound echoed in the night, making him wince. The wolf's growl deepened, almost a growl of warning that now seemed to vibrate in his chest. The doctor's eyes darted to the shadows where he had seen movement. There, just beyond the veil of trees, a figure appeared, just a silhouette at first, barely discernible in the dim moonlight. It was a woman. She stepped out of the darkness with a slow, deliberate pace, her figure tall and commanding, her eyes gleaming with a strange, unnatural intensity. She wore a cloak that blended into the night, as if she were one with the shadows. But what struck Dr. Caldwell the most was the air around her. There was a chill to it, an unnatural cold that cut through the warmth of the night. The wolf, which had been so protective of Clara's grave moments before, suddenly froze. Its eyes flickered from the woman to the doctor, as if caught between loyalty and fear. The tension in the air was palpable. Dr. Caldwell felt his pulse quicken, and despite the cold night, a layer of sweat began to form on his brow. There was something about this woman that sent a primal warning through his body. He instinctively took a step back, unsure of what he was dealing with. The woman's voice was soft, but it carried across the graveyard with an unnatural clarity. "You should leave, Doctor," she said, her words laced with an eerie calm. "You've seen enough." Dr. Caldwell stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. His mind raced, but the words escaped him. Who was she? How did she know who he was? The strange energy in the air made it hard to focus, his thoughts muddled as if the very air was thickening with some unspoken force. His fingers brushed against the vial in his coat pocket, and a shiver ran down his spine. Did she know what he had discovered in the coffin? Had she been watching him? "I don't understand," he finally managed to say, his voice rough with uncertainty. "What do you want?" The woman's eyes gleamed with a cold, knowing smile, but there was no warmth in it. "It's not about what I want," she replied softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "It's about what Clara wanted. What she always wanted." The mention of Clara's name sent a jolt through the doctor's body. How could this woman know her? And why did she seem so familiar with Clara's life, even though the villagers had always described Clara as a reclusive figure, a woman who kept to herself? There were so many unanswered questions, and now it seemed as though the answers were slipping further away, tangled in shadows and mystery. "What do you know about her?" Dr. Caldwell asked, his voice tightening with a mix of fear and frustration. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as if sizing him up. "I'm someone who has watched Clara closely for a long time." "Longer than you think," she said, her gaze now fixed on the doctor, piercing through him with unsettling accuracy. "I know things about her that no one else does. And I know what you've discovered. That vial you're carrying, if you knew the truth about it, you would understand why you should leave now. But it's too late for that now. You've seen too much." A gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a shiver down Dr. Caldwell's spine. The woman's voice grew softer, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a warning. Clara was more than just a woman. She was a part of something much older, much darker than you can imagine. And now that you've come here, you're tangled in it too. The doctor could barely process her words. A part of him wanted to laugh, dismissing her as some wild-eyed mystic or trickster, but another part, deeper, more instinctual, felt that she was speaking the truth. The very presence of the wolf beside him, its unwavering watch over Clara's grave, spoke to something beyond the natural world. And then there was the vial, still burning with strange energy in his pocket. What had it been? What had it been used for? "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice more steady now, though his hands were trembling. "What do you want with Clara?" "With the wolf? With me?" The woman's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm not here for Clara. I'm here for you, Doctor," she said, her voice low and full of meaning. "You see, Clara was always meant to protect something. A secret that's been hidden for centuries. She was just a key, a small part of a much larger plan. But you, Dr. Caldwell, are the one who will unlock it." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Dr. Caldwell's mind raced, trying to grasp the implications. What was this woman talking about? What did she mean by unlock it? And why him? He was just a doctor, just a man of science. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettling the connection between him and Clara seemed. The strange illness she had suffered from, the mysterious vial, the wolf's constant presence, it all seemed to point to something bigger. Something he couldn't quite understand. The woman's gaze softened, but there was no warmth in it. Instead, it was cold, calculating. "You should have left when you had the chance, Doctor. But now it's too late. The path you've started on, it won't end until you've uncovered everything. The truth about Clara. The truth about the wolf." The truth about what's been hidden from this world for so long. Dr. Caldwell's mind reeled. What was she talking about? What truth? And why was the wolf still guarding the grave, still watching, as if it knew something he didn't? As if it understood the danger he was now in. He reached for the vial in his pocket once more, the small glass object feeling heavier than ever. He had no idea what he was holding, but he knew one thing for certain: the answers to this mystery weren't going to come easily. And the deeper he went, the more entangled he would become in a web of secrets, lies, and dangers he couldn't yet comprehend. The woman took a final step back, her shadow merging with the night. "We'll meet again, Doctor. You'll see. And when you do, you'll be ready." With that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving Dr. Caldwell standing alone with the wolf, the coffin, and a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen for a long moment after the woman disappeared into the shadows, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The wolf, now silent, was still watching him, its eyes never leaving his face, its body tense, alert, as though waiting for something to happen. The graveyard around him felt like it was closing in, the trees bending closer, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. He felt the weight of something ancient and unyielding pressing down on him, something beyond his understanding. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "You're the one who will unlock it." He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something dark, something vast, and that every step he took brought him closer to an abyss he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But there was no turning back now. He had already seen too much. The vial, the wolf, the mysterious figure, they were all pieces of a puzzle that, somehow, he was now a part of. And that realization chilled him to his core. He looked back at the coffin, his hands trembling as he approached it once again. The sight of it, so ordinary yet so charged with the weight of unanswered questions, made his heart beat faster. It wasn't just Clara's body that lay here, there was something deeper, something more profound that had been hidden away, something that now seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. As he reached down to open the coffin again, the wolf growled softly, its eyes narrowing, but it didn't move. It was almost as if the creature was giving him a choice. A warning without words. Dr. Caldwell hesitated for a moment, considering the creature's silent plea to stop. But he couldn't. He needed answers. He needed to understand why the wolf had stayed by Clara's side, why it had guarded this grave so fiercely, and what connection it had to the strange vial. The doctor's fingers brushed against the lid of the coffin once more, his breath quickening as he lifted it. This time, when he looked inside, his heart skipped a beat. There was something new, something that hadn't been there before. A faint shimmer, barely visible in the dim moonlight, hovered above the earth where the coffin had been closed. It wasn't a shadow, nor was it a reflection of light. It was like the air itself was alive, moving, swirling in an almost hypnotic dance. Dr. Caldwell leaned closer, squinting to see what it was. His pulse quickened. There, beneath the strange shimmer, he could just make out the faint outline of something in the soil, a marking, etched deep into the earth, like an ancient symbol. It was circular in shape, with intricate lines extending outward like the rays of the sun, but twisted and bent in unnatural ways, as though it had been drawn by a hand that didn't belong to this world. The wolf's growl grew louder, its body tense, but Dr. Caldwell didn't move. He was transfixed by the symbol, his eyes fixed on it as though it were pulling him in, drawing him closer. He could feel something in his gut, a cold sensation spreading through him, telling him to step away, to leave. But his curiosity, his need for answers, overpowered that voice. He had to know. His fingers dug into the earth, his hands trembling as he scraped the soil away, inch by inch, uncovering more of the symbol. The air around him seemed to thicken, a charged energy swirling, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in the darkness, shapes moving just beyond his sight, like shadows dancing. Just out of reach. He quickly turned, but there was nothing there. The wolf barked once, sharp and commanding, snapping Dr. Caldwell back to reality. He looked at the creature and saw its eyes were wide with warning now, its body coiled, ready to spring into action. It was clear that whatever was happening, the wolf knew more than Dr. Caldwell did, and it was terrified. Before the doctor could react, the ground beneath him began to tremble, ever so slightly at first, but then with increasing intensity. The earth shook, and Dr. Caldwell felt his knees buckle as the coffin rattled. A sound, low, guttural, and filled with an ancient power, rose from deep within the ground, reverberating through the air like the voice of something long forgotten, something that had been sleeping beneath the earth for centuries. His heart pounded in his chest as the tremors grew stronger. The shimmer above the grave flared brightly, blindingly so, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. The graveyard, the trees, even the wolf, all were swallowed by a blinding light. And then, just as quickly, everything fell silent. The glow faded, and the world around him returned, but something was different. The air was thick with a strange energy, almost electric, as though the very atmosphere had changed. And the wolf, once still and wary, was now pacing back and forth, its eyes frantic, its growls louder and more desperate. The doctor could see its fear. It was as if the creature knew something was coming, something it couldn't stop. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse with life, as if something below the earth was awakening. Dr. Caldwell stumbled back, his eyes scanning the graveyard, searching for answers. That's when he saw it, a shadow moving quickly through the trees, darting toward him. He didn't have time to react before a figure stepped into view, emerging from the darkness. It was the woman. The one from before. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. She had returned, but she was not the same. There was something different about her now, something that made her seem even more unsettling, more powerful. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, watching him, her gaze unwavering. Dr. Caldwell's heart raced in his chest, his breath shallow, as the tension in the air thickened. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient and terrifying. The woman raised her hand, and the wolf immediately stopped pacing, its growls dying down, its body lowering to the ground in submission. "You've done it now," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "You've uncovered what should have stayed buried." Dr. Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, as though the very air around him was squeezing the life from him. The ground beneath him trembled again, stronger this time, as if the earth itself was protesting his actions. He could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful building beneath the surface, rising toward him with every passing second. The woman took a step forward, her eyes gleaming with cold knowledge. "This is the beginning," she said, her voice now laced with a chilling certainty. "The truth has been unleashed. And now, you must face it." And with that, the world around him seemed to explode into chaos. The ground split open, a deep, resonating crack tearing through the graveyard. Dr. Caldwell had no time to react. The darkness swallowed everything. The crack in the earth grew wider, and the ground beneath Dr. Caldwell's feet began to shake violently. The air around him crackled with an unnatural energy, as if the entire world was trembling in response to something ancient stirring from deep below. The wolf, still crouched low to the ground, let out a haunting, desperate howl, a cry that seemed to reverberate through the night, echoing off the trees and bouncing through the graveyard. Dr. Caldwell's heart raced, his thoughts spinning in a haze. The ground beneath him was splitting apart, revealing a deep, gaping chasm that seemed to go on forever. The fissures in the earth pulsed with an eerie, dim light, as if something was trying to emerge. His breath caught in his throat as he stumbled back, his eyes locked on the abyss that was growing wider by the second. Something was rising from the depths, something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But just as the darkness seemed to consume everything in its path, the woman stepped forward again. Her eyes glowed with a strange, otherworldly fire, her face now more visible in the dim light, yet still shrouded in a sense of mystery. Her presence felt like a force of nature, like she belonged to the shadows and the ancient power that was awakening beneath the earth. "You should never have come here," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm for the chaos surrounding them. "Now it is too late for you, too late for everyone." Dr. Caldwell's pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He could barely process her words as the ground shook beneath his feet, but the terror in her voice, the absolute certainty that this was the end, sent a chill deep into his bones. What had he uncovered? What had he unleashed? Then, in the blink of an eye, the woman's gaze shifted to the wolf. The creature, which had been growling low in the distance, suddenly stiffened. Its body tensed, its teeth bared. But it wasn't fear in its eyes, it was recognition. It was as if the wolf understood something that Dr. Caldwell didn't. And then, just as quickly, the woman raised her hand toward the wolf, and the beast's body froze. The growl that had been vibrating in the air died out instantly. The doctor watched in horror as the wolf's eyes glazed over, and it stood unnaturally still, no longer an animal but something else entirely. It wasn't just a guardian, it was an accomplice. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The wolf had been protecting the grave for a reason, not just out of instinct. It had been part of this, part of the ritual, part of the secret that had been kept hidden for so long. The chilling truth was unfolding before him in real time, and he was now in the center of it all. A sound like a low hum began to fill the air, growing louder and louder. It wasn't the tremor of the earth, but something else, something more primal, like a voice from deep within the earth itself, calling, summoning, beckoning. Dr. Caldwell stumbled backward, his heart racing in panic. He could feel the pressure in his chest, the air thickening, as though the very atmosphere was closing in on him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto him with an unshakable intensity. "The truth you've been chasing, it was never meant for you," she whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear above the growing hum. "But now that you're here, now that you've seen, there's no escaping it." His hands trembled as he reached for the vial in his pocket again. The same vial that had started this madness. The very vial that had drawn him into this dark world. He had to understand it, had to know what it contained, what the woman had meant by unlocking the truth. As his fingers wrapped around the cold glass, the ground trembled once more, more violently this time. The vibrations were almost unbearable. And then, without warning, the shadows around him seemed to converge. The world around him darkened, like a heavy, suffocating fog rolling in. The trees swayed as though bending under an invisible weight, and the earth itself seemed to groan in response. Dr. Caldwell could no longer see the stars above, the moon was blotted out by a darkness so thick, it felt like the night itself was closing in. The woman's figure began to shift, her body blurring and stretching as if she were no longer fully bound by the laws of nature. Her form seemed to flicker, like a mirage, a shifting silhouette of shadows and light. In the darkness, the hum of power grew to a deafening roar, and suddenly, from the earth beneath him, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. They were yellow, bright and unblinking, filled with an unnatural intelligence. Dr. Caldwell's breath caught in his throat. The wolf, now completely still, seemed to be locked in place, its eyes no longer its own. They were now the same glowing yellow, the same cold fire that burned in the woman's gaze. The transformation was complete. The creature, no longer just an animal, was now something far darker, something ancient, something tied to the very force that had been awakened beneath the earth. The woman stepped forward again, her eyes now full of something that could only be described as triumph. "You thought the truth was about Clara," she said, her voice filled with an unsettling calm. But it was never just about her. It was about the bloodline she carried, the bloodline she protected. The bloodline that has been guarding an ancient power, a power that was never meant to be released. Dr. Caldwell's mind reeled. Bloodline? What was she talking about? Clara had never mentioned anything about a bloodline, anything about guarding power. He had known Clara only as the quiet woman in the village, the one who had lived alone and kept to herself. There was no way she could have been hiding something like this. Or was there? The ground beneath his feet trembled again, and a crack of thunder split the sky. The air grew colder, and the glowing eyes of the wolf seemed to burn brighter, drawing him in. His hands shook as he held the vial, unsure of what he was supposed to do next. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? Had he unlocked something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined? The woman's voice brought him back to the present. You will soon understand, Doctor. But it will cost you more than you can afford. Dr. Caldwell turned to face her, the vial clenched tightly in his fist. He could feel the earth vibrating beneath him, as if it were alive, as if it were ready to swallow him whole. He had only one choice left. But was he ready to make it? Would he survive the truth he had been chasing all this time? The world seemed to be closing in, and there was no escape from the darkness now. And just as the tension reached its peak, something changed. The earth cracked open one final time, and from the depths, a shadowed figure began to rise, a figure far more monstrous than the wolf, far more terrifying than anything he had ever seen before. The truth, it seemed, was finally about to reveal itself in the most unimaginable way. The shadowed figure that rose from the depths was unlike anything Dr. Caldwell had ever seen. It was not human, nor was it animal. Its form was towering, a grotesque blend of limbs that twisted unnaturally, its body a mass of shadows and glowing veins that pulsed with an eerie light. Its eyes, now fully visible, were no longer yellow, they were pure white, glowing with a cold, merciless intensity that seemed to pierce through the very soul. The air grew thick with dread, as if the very earth itself were holding its breath. The wolf, once a powerful force of nature, stood motionless, its body locked in place, its glowing eyes fixed on the creature emerging from the chasm. The woman beside Dr. Caldwell seemed unfazed by the monstrosity before them, her calm expression betraying no sign of fear. Instead, there was a look of quiet satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. You see now, don't you? She said softly, her voice almost a whisper. This is the true legacy. Clara's bloodline was never meant to protect her. It was meant to protect him. Dr. Caldwell could hardly breathe. The words echoed in his mind as his heart raced. The creature before him was more than just a being of shadow. It was an ancient force, something that had been buried beneath the earth for millennia, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And it wasn't just a guardian, it was the true power that Clara's bloodline had kept hidden. This power had been suppressed for centuries, but now, it was free. The woman's eyes gleamed with an unsettling joy as she took a step forward, her hand extended toward the creature. He is the one who was always meant to rule over this world, she said, as if speaking of a god. The one who will rise above the rest, the one who will control everything. Dr. Caldwell's mind was racing, his thoughts in a whirlwind of confusion. He had come to the graveyard seeking answers about Clara, about the mysterious wolf, about the strange vial he had found. But now, everything had changed. The vial was not just some odd relic. It was a key to releasing this ancient being. The wolf, once a protector, was now a mere pawn in a much larger, darker game. And Clara. Clara had been part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. She had known about this, had kept it hidden, but she hadn't been able to stop it. His eyes darted between the woman and the creature. The air was thick with power, so heavy that it felt like it could crush him. And yet, There was something pulling him toward the vial in his pocket. The vial that had been the catalyst for all of this, the very reason he was standing here now, witnessing the awakening of something that should have never been awakened. He had to act. Without thinking, he pulled the vial from his pocket, the cold glass biting into his palm. The woman saw the movement, and a shadow of surprise crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by a smirk. "You think you can stop this?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. "You are too late." Dr. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He didn't know what the vial would do, but he had no choice but to try. He uncorked it and poured the contents into the air, the liquid shimmering as it touched the ground. Almost immediately, the ground trembled again, the shadows around him shifting and swirling, the power in the air growing even stronger. The creature let out a guttural roar, its form writhing in pain as the light from the vial spread across the graveyard, illuminating the darkness. The woman's expression changed, no longer filled with smug confidence, but now with an undeniable fear. She stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No," she whispered. This was never supposed to happen. But it was too late. The vial had triggered something that neither she nor the creature had anticipated. The ancient power that had been waiting for centuries began to unravel, its hold on the world weakening. The shadows that had once been so solid and powerful now began to dissipate, torn apart by the light of the vial. The creature howled again, its form flickering and distorting as it struggled against the force that had been unleashed. Dr. Caldwell didn't stop. His hands shook as he lifted the vial higher, the light from it now searing through the darkness. He could feel the power of the earth beneath him shifting, as if the land itself were rejecting the creature's presence. The hum in the air grew louder, and then, with a final, earth-shattering roar, the creature collapsed into a heap of shadow, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted. The silence that followed was deafening, a stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Dr. Caldwell stood in the middle of the graveyard, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The woman, now kneeling on the ground, stared at the spot where the creature had been, her face twisted in shock and disbelief. "How?" she began, but her voice faltered. "How did you?" But before she could finish, Dr. Caldwell turned to face her, his expression hardening. "I didn't stop it," he said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying fury. "You did." The woman's eyes widened in confusion, but Dr. Caldwell didn't wait for her to comprehend. He reached down, grabbing the vial from where it had fallen to the ground, and with a swift motion, he threw it into the chasm that had opened up. The light from the vial flickered once more before it vanished into the depths, sealing the ancient power away once and for all. For a moment, nothing happened. The air remained still, the darkness receding, leaving behind only the echoes of the chaos that had unfolded. Then, slowly, the woman stood up, her face now devoid of emotion. She no longer seemed like the powerful figure who had guided him here, she was just a person, vulnerable and broken. "You," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand." Dr. Caldwell took a step back, his mind still reeling. "I understand enough." The woman's gaze turned toward the sky, and for a moment, Dr. Caldwell saw something shift in her eyes, a brief flicker of regret, or perhaps defeat. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of the woman he had first encountered. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low, almost distant. "This isn't over." Before Dr. Caldwell could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the graveyard as the night swallowed her whole. The air around him was still, the graveyard now eerily calm, but the unease lingered in his chest. He had stopped the creature, sealed it away, but something told him this was far from the end. The truth was far more complex, far darker, than he had ever imagined. And as he looked down at the empty grave, at the remnants of the vial and the shadows that still clung to the edges of the night, he realized one thing. Some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. And the truth had only just begun to reveal itself. Dr. Caldwell stood in the graveyard, the echoes of the chaos slowly fading into an eerie silence. The air had shifted, no longer thick with dread, but heavy with a quiet finality. The woman was gone, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to reclaim their territory. And yet, a lingering feeling remained with him. The battle was over, but it felt like the story was far from finished. His eyes drifted to the spot where the creature had once stood, now nothing but a shadow in the earth. The ground was still cracked open, and the faint glow from the depths had all but vanished, leaving behind only an unsettling emptiness. He had sealed the ancient force away, but that didn't erase the weight of what had happened. He had uncovered something that wasn't meant to be known, something tied to Clara's bloodline, tied to a power that had been hidden for centuries. But who was Clara really? And why had she been part of something so much bigger than herself? Dr. Caldwell still had so many questions. As he walked through the graveyard, his mind replaying the events of the night, he couldn't help but wonder if Clara had known the true nature of her legacy. Had she always known what lay beneath the surface, or had she been a pawn in this dark game, just like him? He reached the edge of the graveyard, his thoughts racing, when he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The small wooden cross marking Clara's grave, the very grave that had been the starting point of this entire journey, was now different. The earth around it had shifted, and a new marker had appeared beside it, one that hadn't been there before. Dr. Caldwell knelt down to examine it, his fingers trembling as he brushed away the dirt. The name on the gravestone was familiar, but it wasn't Clara's. It was another name, one he hadn't expected to see. It read, Hannah Caldwell, beloved daughter. His breath caught in his throat. Hannah. His own daughter. Confusion swept through him. His daughter? How was this possible? There was no record of a daughter in his life, no memory of a woman named Hannah in his past. Yet, here it was, this gravestone, placed in the ground with a sense of permanence that made it undeniable. Dr. Caldwell's mind raced as he stood, staring at the name, the realization dawning on him in slow, agonizing waves. The woman in the graveyard, the one who had led him through this twisted tale, the one who had seemed so certain of the ancient power that had been unleashed, she wasn't just some random figure. She was tied to him in a way that defied logic, something deeper than blood, deeper than fate. It was a connection he could barely comprehend. But as the shock settled in, another realization hit him. Clara's bloodline, the very bloodline that had protected the power, had never been just Clara's. It had always been shared. Hannah Caldwell had been a part of this story all along, and the woman who had appeared in the graveyard was likely tied to her as well. Was it possible that his own bloodline had been intertwined with Clara's all these years? Dr. Caldwell's mind reeled with questions. Had he been blind to the truth all this time? What had he missed? The grave before him, the name on it, seemed like the final piece of a puzzle that he hadn't even realized was unfinished. The eerie quiet of the night had become oppressive again, but now there was no uncertainty. He had to find answers. His hand reached out toward the grave, his fingers tracing the carved name, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. There was no turning back from this. The connections he had unearthed, between Clara, the wolf, the woman, and now his own blood, were undeniable. He had been led here for a reason, not just to uncover the truth, but to face it. The woman had been right about one thing: the truth was never meant for him. It had never been something he was supposed to find. But now that he could no longer ignore it. He had opened the door, and there was no closing it again. But as he stood there, reflecting on everything that had transpired, he realized something else. In his search for truth, in his quest to uncover the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface, he had unknowingly become a part of the very legacy he had tried to unravel. His own bloodline had been drawn into this web of darkness, whether he liked it or not. The past, it seemed, wasn't just a history to be read or forgotten. It was alive, pulsing through the land, through the blood of the living. And now, it was his to carry forward. He turned back toward the graveyard, the night still heavy with mystery, but now, there was a sense of purpose in his step. The woman's warnings had been clear: there would be no escaping this truth, no turning back from the past. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: his life, and the lives of those around him, had been irrevocably changed. The shadows in the graveyard seemed to shift again, but this time, they weren't as oppressive. They were just shadows, part of the world, part of the story. And for the first time, Dr. Caldwell understood that he wasn't just a spectator. He was a part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. The power, the mystery, the darkness, it was all inside him now. As he walked away from the grave, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of finality. But also a sense of something else. Something deeper. He didn't know if it was the end or the beginning of something even darker. What he did know was that the world around him had shifted, and he had been forced to face it. The truth had been revealed, but in the process, it had uncovered something far greater. There were more questions, more layers to uncover, but now, Dr. Caldwell wasn't afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next. And as he walked back toward the fading lights of the village, one thought echoed in his mind: some truths, once known, can never be forgotten.